The first man came alone. He came on a Tuesday morning on a gray horse with a letter sealed in red wax and the polite smile of a man who expected to leave with what he had come for. His name was Garrett Venn, and he was the personal courier of Lord Aldrich Stroud, who owned 11,000 acres in the Eastern Territory and who had, 6 weeks earlier, lost a piece of property he wanted back. The property was an orc woman named Kess. She was sitting in Owen Blackwell's kitchen when the courier arrived, drinking tea from a tin cup and reading a small book of poems that Owen had lent her from the shelf above his bed, and she did not know that the man on the gray horse was there for her until Owen came back inside from the porch with the opened letter in his hand and the particular expression of a man who has just read something he expected to read eventually, but had been hoping would take longer to arrive. Owen Blackwell was 47 years old, a cattle rancher who ran 80 head on 200 acres of grass and scrubland at the western edge of the Harrow Valley. He was a big man, broad across the chest and thick through the arms, with curly dark hair going gray, a heavy jaw, deep brown eyes, and a nose that had been broken twice and set badly both times. He was not handsome. He was the kind of man people called solid, which was a word that meant reliable and strong and not particularly interesting to look at. And Owen had made his peace with all three of those things a long time ago. His wife had died 11 years ago of a hemorrhage during childbirth. The child had not survived either. Owen had buried them side by side in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church in the village of Harrow, and had gone back to his ranch and had not spoken about it to anyone since, which was not because he did not think about it, but because the thinking was a thing he did alone, the way he did most things alone. Kess had arrived at the ranch 5 weeks before the courier. She had arrived in the back of a merchant's wagon, hidden under a tarpaulin between crates of dry goods, because the merchant, a man named Del Sutter, owed Owen 3 years of unpaid feed bills and had decided that delivering a fugitive orc to Owen's ranch was a creative way to settle the debt without actually paying it. Del had pulled the wagon up to Owen's barn at dusk, lifted the tarpaulin, and said, "She's been running from Stroud's estate for 2 weeks. She made it to my warehouse in Brennan's Crossing, and I hid her because I am a fool with a conscience. I cannot keep her. Stroud's men are looking. She needs a place they will not look. Your ranch is the last place anyone would look because you are the most boring man in the Harrow Valley, and nobody thinks you would do anything interesting enough to warrant investigation. I am settling my feed bill with this. We are even." Owen had looked at the woman in the wagon. She was sitting on the boards between the crates with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and her dark eyes watching him with the absolute stillness of a person who had stopped being surprised by what happened to her a long time ago. She was perhaps 30. Her skin was the deep, rich green of the lowland clans, darker than the mountain orcs Owen had seen at the eastern markets. Her hair was long and black and had been braided once but was now loose and tangled. She was thin, but not starving. She wore a long gray wool dress that was too large for her and leather shoes that were too small. She had a bruise on her left cheekbone that was 4 or 5 days old and turning yellow at the edges. Owen had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had looked at Del. "Del, you are a fool with a conscience and also a coward, because you have brought this woman to my ranch, knowing that if Stroud finds her here, it is my neck and not yours. That is correct. and you consider this a fair settlement of 3 years of feed bills. I consider it the only settlement I have available. The feed bills are 42 silvers. The woman is worth more than 42 silvers to Stroud. You are getting the better deal." Owen had thought about this. He had thought about the bruise on the woman's cheekbone and about the way she was sitting in the wagon with her arms around her knees, and about the fact that she had not spoken a word since Dell had lifted the tarpaulin. He had thought about his wife and his child in the cemetery behind the Methodist church, and about the particular way a man's priorities rearranged themselves after he had buried the two people he loved most in a single afternoon. "Get your wagon off my property, Dell. Leave the woman. We are even." Dell had left. Kess had stayed. The first 3 days she had slept in the spare room of the ranch house, which was a small room at the back with a window and a cot and a bolt on the inside of the door that Owen had installed without being asked. She had eaten what Owen put on the table. She had not spoken. On the 4th day, she had come out of the spare room in the morning and found Owen at the kitchen table drinking coffee, and she had sat down across from him and said, "My name is Kess. I was Lord Stroud's cook for 4 years. Before that, I was his housemaid. Before that, I was purchased at auction in the town of Kelmore when I was 23. I am 30 now. I have been property for 7 years. I do not intend to be property again." Owen had poured her a cup of coffee and set it in front of her. "All right. That is all you have to say. What would you like me to say? Most men ask questions. Where did you come from? What did he do to you? Why did you run? I can see where you came from by the bruise on your face. I can guess what he did to you by the way you flinch when I move my hand too fast. I know why you ran, because I would have run too. The questions answer themselves. I do not need to make you say the answers out loud." Kess had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had picked up the coffee and taken a long, slow drink and set it down and said, "You are not what I expected. I am a cattle rancher. Nobody expects anything from a cattle rancher." That had been 5 weeks ago. In 5 weeks, Kess had transformed the ranch kitchen from a room where a man heated canned beans and fried eggs into a room that smelled like food. Real food. She cooked the way a person cooked who had been trained in a professional kitchen and who understood that cooking was not just the application of heat to ingredients, but the arrangement of flavors in a sequence that told a story on the tongue. She made stews from the cuts of beef Owen had been feeding to the dogs. She made bread from flour and water, and a starter culture she had built from scratch in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. She made a preserve from the wild plums that grew along the creek at the southern edge of the property that Owen had never harvested, because he had not known they were edible. She made the ranch house smell like a place where people lived instead of a place where a man slept between shifts of cattle work. And the transformation was so gradual and so complete that Owen did not realize how much had changed until one evening when he came in from the barn and the kitchen was warm and the bread was on the table, and there was a woman humming something he did not recognize while she stirred a pot on the stove. And he stood in the doorway for a moment because the scene was so close to a thing he had lost 11 years ago that it took his breath in a way that was not grief, but something adjacent to it. But Kess was not only a cook. She was a woman who had spent 4 years in the household of a man who controlled 11,000 acres, and who entertained the territorial governor, and who conducted business at a table where Kess had served and cleared and listened. She knew things. She knew which merchants in the Eastern Territory were honest and which were not. She knew which livestock prices were being artificially held low by Stroud's Trading Company and which were being inflated. She knew the names of every foreman on every Stroud property and the schedules of the patrol riders who enforced Stroud's boundaries. She knew these things because she had been invisible in the rooms where these things were discussed, and invisible people heard everything. On the third week, she had sat Owen down at the kitchen table after dinner and told him that he was selling his cattle at the Harrow market for 30% less than they were worth, because the Harrow market was controlled by a buyer named Crew, who had a standing arrangement with Stroud's Trading Company to keep cattle prices in the valley artificially low. She told him that if he drove his cattle 2 days south to the market at Fenwick instead, he would get the true price, which was nearly double what Crew was paying him. Owen had stared at her. "How do you know this?" "Because I served dinner to Crew and Stroud on 14 separate occasions, and they discussed a pricing arrangement in front of me as though I were a piece of furniture. Furniture does not repeat what it hears. I am no longer furniture." Owen had driven 40 head to the Fenwick market the following week. He had sold them for nearly double the Harrow price. He had come home with more money than he had made in 3 years of selling at Harrow. He had sat at the kitchen table and counted the coins and looked at Kess and said, "You just made me 300 silvers in one afternoon. I made you the price you were always owed. The 300 silvers was always yours. It was being stolen from you by a buyer who assumed you would never check." Now, Garrett Venn was standing on the porch with a letter from Lord Stroud, and Owen was standing in the kitchen reading it. The letter was polite in the way that letters from powerful men were polite, which is to say it was polite in grammar and threatening in content. It said that Lord Stroud was aware that a piece of his property had been located at the ranch of Owen Blackwell. It said that Lord Stroud valued his property highly and wished to have it returned immediately. It said that Lord Stroud was prepared to compensate Mr. Blackwell for the inconvenience of having housed his property in the amount of 10 silvers, which Lord Stroud considered generous. It said that if the property was not returned within 7 days, Lord Stroud would be forced to take more direct action to recover it. Owen folded the letter. He walked back to the porch. Garrett Venn was standing there with his gray horse and his polite smile. "Mr. Blackwell, I trust the letter is clear." "It is clear." "And your answer?" "My answer is no." The smile did not change, but the eyes behind it did. "Mr. Blackwell, I would encourage you to reconsider. Lord Stroud is not a man who—" "I know what Lord Stroud is. I know what he does with his property. I know what kind of man sends a courier with a letter that calls a woman a piece of property and offers 10 silvers for her return as though she were a missing saddle. My answer is no. You can tell Lord Stroud that his property has a name, and that name is Kess, and that Kess is not going back to his house or any house where she is called property. You can tell him that. You can also tell him that the next time he sends a courier to my ranch, the courier should bring more than a letter." Garrett Venn's polite smile disappeared entirely. He mounted his gray horse. He rode east without speaking. Owen went back inside. Kess was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had heard everything. "Owen, he is gone. He will come back." "Not him. Stroud will send different men." "How many?" as many as he needs. Stroud does not lose things he considers his. He lost me once, and it has been eating at him for 6 weeks. The letter was the polite version. The next version will not be polite. Owen thought about this. He thought about it for the rest of the day while he worked the cattle in the lower pasture, and while he mended the fence along the creek, and while he fed the horses, and while he sat at the kitchen table that evening eating the stew Kess had made from a cut of beef that would have gone to the dogs a month ago. He thought about his 200 acres and his 80 head and his 47 years and the 2 graves behind the Methodist church and the woman sitting across the table from him who had made his kitchen smell like a place where people lived. Kess, yes, I need help. I cannot defend this ranch alone against whatever Stroud sends. I need men. Do you know anyone? Kess thought about this. Del Sutter. Del Sutter is a coward. Del Sutter is a coward with a warehouse full of men who owe him favors and who do not like Lord Stroud. Stroud's trading company has been undercutting Del's business for 3 years. Del will not fight, but Del will send men who will, for the right price. What is the right price? Tell Del that the Fenwick Market connection is open and that you will sell his goods there alongside your cattle at no commission. Del has been trying to get into the Fenwick Market for 6 years and has not been able to because Stroud's buyers have locked him out. If you offer Del a way into Fenwick, Del will send you 10 men for free. Owen looked at her. You know a great deal about Del Sutter's business. I served dinner to Stroud and crew 14 times. Del Sutter's name came up at 7 of those dinners. Stroud hated Del because Del was the only merchant in the valley who would not take his pricing. Del is a coward, but he is an honest coward, and those are the useful kind. Owen rode to Del Sutter's warehouse in Brennan's Crossing the next morning. He made the offer. Del accepted it in under 30 seconds. Del sent 8 men to the ranch that afternoon. They were rough men, warehouse workers, and teamsters, not soldiers, but they were big, and they were angry at Stroud for 3 years of business interference, and they were willing to stand on a fence line with rifles for the satisfaction of being part of the problem that Stroud could not solve with a letter. Owen also rode to the 2 neighboring ranches. He spoke to Colum Rath, who ran the spread to the south, and to Etta Marsh, who ran the spread to the north. Colum owed Owen a favor from 3 winters ago when Owen had helped pull Colum's entire herd out of a flooded creek during a spring melt. Etta owed Owen nothing, but she disliked Stroud on principle because Stroud's boundary riders had been encroaching on her northern pasture for 2 years, and the magistrate had done nothing about it. Colum sent 4 men. Etta sent 3, and came herself with a rifle over her shoulder and a hat pulled low and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for an excuse to be angry at Stroud in a way that involved standing on someone's fence line. By the evening of the 6th day, Owen had 15 people on his property, 8 from Del, 4 from Colum, 3 plus Etta from the north, plus Owen himself and Kess, who had quietly produced a hunting bow from somewhere Owen had not known. She kept a hunting bow, and who was now sitting on the ranch house roof in the dark, cleaning the string with the focused attention of a person who knew exactly what she was doing. They came on the 7th day, not 15, 23. Lord Stroud had sent 23 men on horseback, led by his head foreman, a man named Brask, who was known throughout the Eastern Territory as the kind of man who solved problems by making the problems too frightened to remain problems. Brask was a huge man with a shaved head and a thick black beard and arms the size of fence posts and a voice that carried across a valley. He pulled his horse up at the ranch gate at dawn and called out, "Blackwell, I am here on Lord Stroud's authority. You have his property. You have been given a week. The week is over. Surrender the woman, and no one gets hurt." Owen was standing at the gate. Beside him stood Dell's 8 men, Column's 4, Etta and her 3. 15 people on the fence line, rifles, axes, 1 pitchfork, 1 woman on a roof with a bow. Owen spoke calmly. "Brask, I have been wanting to talk to you, not about Kess, about the cattle market at Harrow, specifically about the arrangement between your employer and a buyer named Crew that has been keeping cattle prices in this valley 30% below market value for the last 6 years. Brask frowned. This was not the conversation he had expected. "That is not why I am here." "I know, but it is why they are here." Owen gestured at the 15 people on the fence line. "Del Sutter lost 3 years of revenue because Stroud's Trading Company undercut his business. Colum Rath lost 2,000 silvers last year selling at Harrow instead of Fenwick because nobody told him the Harrow price was fixed. Etta Marsh has been losing pasture to Stroud's boundary riders for 2 years. Every person standing on this fence has a grievance with your employer that has nothing to do with the woman in my kitchen. The woman in my kitchen is just the reason they finally showed up." Brask looked at the fence line. He counted. 15 armed people, most of them angry, some of them grinning. Etta was grinning. She was the kind of woman who grinned at confrontations the way other people grinned at jokes. Brask looked back at Owen. "Stroud has 23 men behind me. I can count. I can also count the number of those 23 who are paid enough to die for a man who fixes cattle prices. My guess is 0. Your men are hired hands. Mine are neighbors. There is a difference. Hired hands go home when the pay is not worth the risk. Neighbors stay because the grudge is personal." Brask was not a stupid man. He was a man who had been solving problems for Stroud for 15 years and who had learned that the best solutions were the ones where nobody had to prove anything. He looked at the fence line again. He looked at the roof, where a green-skinned woman with a bow was watching him with the particular calm of a person who had already decided where she would put the first arrow. He looked at Owen. "What do you want?" "I want Stroud to release Kess from her contract. I want a written document signed by Stroud, declaring her a free woman with no claim on her labor or her person. I want the document delivered to the territorial magistrate for filing, and I want the Harrow pricing arrangement with Crew terminated. Those are my terms. Stroud will never agree to. Stroud will agree to all of it, because the alternative is that I ride to the Fenwick magistrate tomorrow morning with 14 witnesses and file a formal complaint about the pricing arrangement, which is illegal under the Territorial Fair Trade Ordinance that has been on the books for 20 years, and that nobody has enforced because nobody in this valley has been angry enough to file the paperwork. Until today. Today, everybody on this fence is angry enough. Stroud can sign a paper and lose a cook and a bad deal with a corrupt buyer. Or he can fight a legal battle in front of a Fenwick magistrate who does not owe him favors. I am a boring cattle rancher, Brask. I have nothing to do but file paperwork and wait. Brask stood very still for a long moment. Behind him, 23 men on horses were watching the fence line and the roof, and the woman with the bow, and the 15 armed neighbors, and the cattle rancher who was offering their employer a choice between losing a little and losing a lot. Brask turned his horse. He rode back to his men. He spoke to them for 2 minutes. Then he turned the horse again and rode back to the gate. "I will take your terms to Lord Stroud. I make no promises. But I will tell you this, Blackwell. In 15 years of working for that man, nobody has ever given him a choice like this. Most people just run. You are the first one to plant your feet and make him count the cost. I am a cattle rancher. I plant things for a living. Feet are not much different from fence posts." Brask almost smiled. Almost. He turned his horse for the last time and rode east with his 23 men behind him. They disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust. The fence line erupted. Dell's men cheered. Column's men pounded each other on the back. Etta lowered her rifle and said, "That was the most fun I have had in 10 years. Owen stood at the gate and watched the dust settle. He did not celebrate. He did not know yet whether Stroud would accept the terms. He knew only that he had played the hand he had been dealt, and that the hand had been dealt to him by a woman who had served dinner to Stroud and crew 14 times, and who had been treated like furniture, and who had remembered every word. Kess came down from the roof. She walked to Owen. She stood beside him at the gate. The bow was over her shoulder, and her face was calm, and her dark eyes were on the road where the dust was still settling. "He will accept," she said. "How do you know?" "Because I know Aldrich Stroud. I cooked his meals for 4 years. I know what he eats when he is confident and what he eats when he is afraid. The meal he will eat tonight, after Brask tells him what happened here, will be the meal he eats when he is afraid. And afraid men sign papers." She was right. The document arrived 12 days later, delivered by a different courier on a different horse. It was signed by Lord Aldrich Stroud. It declared Kess a free woman with no claim on her labor or her person. It was filed with the territorial magistrate at Fenwick that same week. The Harrow pricing arrangement with Crew was terminated the following month after the Fenwick magistrate opened an investigation based on a complaint filed by 14 residents of the Harrow Valley, led by a cattle rancher named Owen Blackwell, whose signature was the first on the page. Del Sutter got his access to the Fenwick market. Colum Rath sold his next herd at the true price and made back half of what he had lost in 6 years. Etta Marsh's boundary dispute was resolved in her favor after the magistrate's office added it to the investigation. The valley changed. It changed slowly, the way valleys changed, but it changed. Owen sat on his porch on the evening the document arrived and held the paper in his hands and read it 3 times. Kess sat beside him. She did not read the paper. She did not need to. She knew what it said, because she had known what it would say since the morning Brask had ridden away from the fence. "Owen, yes, thank you. You thanked me with 300 silvers at the Fenwick market. You thanked me with bread on my table every morning. You thanked me by knowing the name of every buyer and every foreman and every pricing scheme in the Eastern Territory. You do not need to thank me again. I am thanking you for a different thing." "What thing?" "For saying no. When the courier came with the letter, you said no before you had a plan. You said no before you had the men or the neighbors or the legal argument. You said no when it was just you and me and a letter and a 7-day deadline. You said no because no was the right word, and you did not wait until you had a strategy to say it." Owen looked at the paper. He looked at Kess. He looked at the 200 acres stretching out in front of him in the evening light, the grass moving in the wind, the cattle in the lower pasture, the fence line where 15 people had stood 6 weeks ago and changed the economics of a valley. The strategy came later. The no came first. That is usually how it works for me. I am not a strategic man. I am a man who says no to things that are wrong and then spends the next 6 weeks figuring out how to make the no stick. That is a good way to be. It is the only way I know. They sat on the porch. The evening deepened. The cattle moved slowly through the lower pasture. The bread Kess had baked that morning was cooling on the kitchen table behind them. The document declaring her a free woman was folded in Owen's coat pocket. The months that followed the document's arrival brought a kind of quiet that Owen had not experienced in a very long time. It was not the quiet of loneliness, which was the kind of quiet he had known for 11 years. It was the quiet of two people who had been through something difficult together, and who now understood each other well enough that the silence between them was a comfortable place to be. Kess continued to cook. She cooked with the same precision and care she had always cooked with, but now there was something different in the way she moved through the kitchen, a looseness in her shoulders that had not been there before, an ease in the way she reached for the salt or turned from the stove to the table. Owen recognized it because he had seen it in horses when a horse that had been ridden hard was finally turned out to pasture and discovered that it could move without being directed. She was cooking because she wanted to, not because she had been told to. The difference was invisible to anyone who was not paying attention. Owen was paying attention. In the 3rd month after the document, Kess began to expand. Not physically, professionally. She began experimenting with the wild plum preserve she had made from the creekside trees, producing small batches in different flavors with different spices, testing each one on Owen at breakfast and watching his face for the reaction and adjusting accordingly. Owen's face was not an expressive instrument, but Kess had learned to read it the way Owen read horses, by the small involuntary signals that a face made when the conscious mind was not controlling it. By the 4th month, she had 4 flavors that she was satisfied with, and by the 5th month, she was selling them at the Fenwick market in small glass jars with hand-written labels. And by the 6th month, she had a standing order from a general store in Fenwick that wanted 12 jars a week and was willing to pay double the market price because the preserve was, the store owner said, the best thing he had tasted in 40 years of selling food. Owen drove the jars to Fenwick every Tuesday in his cattle wagon. He made the delivery and collected the payment and brought the money home and put it in the tin on the kitchen shelf that had become Kess's tin, which she had not asked for and which Owen had simply started putting her earnings into, because the money was hers, and he was not going to mix it with his. By the end of the 1st year after the document, Kess's preserve business was earning almost as much as Owen's cattle operation. She had hired a young woman from the village, a human girl named Lyra, who was 17 and who had been working in her father's dry goods store and who had jumped at the chance to learn preserving from a woman who could make wild plums taste like something from a governor's table. Lyra came to the ranch 3 days a week. She and Kess worked side by side in the kitchen, and Owen sat on the porch and listened to them talk while they worked, and the sound of 2 women's voices in his kitchen was so close to the sound he had lost 11 years ago that he had to stand up and walk to the barn once to compose himself, because the tears had come without warning, and he did not want Kess to see them and think they were about her when they were about everything. Del Sutter came by the ranch one afternoon at the end of the first year. He came in his merchant's wagon, which was now twice the size of the wagon he had driven the night he had delivered Kess in the back between crates of dry goods. His business had doubled since Owen had opened the Fenwick connection for him. He was a different man now, less nervous, less guilty, more inclined to look people in the eye. He sat on Owen's porch and drank a cup of the tea Kess made from herbs. She grew beside the kitchen door, and he said, "Owen, I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For the way I brought her to you, in the back of a wagon like cargo, under a tarpaulin. I told myself I was doing a good thing, but I was doing it in the worst possible way because I was afraid, and fear makes men treat people like objects, because objects do not require courage." Owen looked at him. "Del, you are a coward with a conscience. The conscience is the part that matters. The cowardice you can work on." "I am working on it." "I can see that." Del left. He came back once a month for the rest of the year, always with a small gift for Kess, always with a business update for Owen, always staying for dinner, because Kess's cooking had become the kind of thing men rode an hour out of their way for. Etta Marsh came by more often. She came twice a week, sometimes 3 times, always with her rifle and her hat, and the grin she wore at confrontations. She and Kess had become friends in the way that 2 women who had each survived things they did not talk about became friends, which was to say quickly and completely and without any of the testing that friendships between men seemed to require. Etta taught Kess to ride. Kess taught Etta to cook. The arrangement was, Owen thought, one of the more productive friendships he had ever witnessed. Colum Rath stopped by once a month to compare cattle prices and to sit on Owen's porch and drink tea and to watch Kess move through the kitchen with a particular expression of a man who was thinking about his own loneliness and was not yet ready to do anything about it. Owen did not comment on this expression. Some things a man had to figure out for himself. The lesson was not in the letter or the fence line or the 23 men who rode away without a fight. It was in the word no, spoken by a man who had buried his wife and child 11 years ago, and who had learned in the years since that the things worth protecting were not the things that belonged to you on paper, but the things that had walked into your kitchen one evening in the back of a merchant's wagon and had made your house smell like bread. Sometimes the most important thing a person can do is say no before he has a plan. The plan comes later. The no comes first, because a no without a plan is still a no, and sometimes the no itself is what brings the plan to the fence line. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like. It helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. The Orc Keeper.